So I'm going to go over some of the ideas from Revolt of the Public, which is one of the most important books of our age if you want to understand some of the instability we're seeing in the world more generally with protests and social unrest and things like that. This book was actually originally published in 2014. Before a lot of this stuff went down, he was publishing it looking at some of the events of, say, 2011 and how they related to the information age, social media, things like that. And he was laying out some principles to understand what was going on then. And the book has turned out to be really prescient in terms of predicting some of the forces that are rising in the world, that are becoming more apparent in many more countries, many more places, with many more governments. So this book, it's really an incredible book. So let me get into it. And the basic idea here is that social media incentivizes destruction and sort of unrest and anger and tearing down the system, but it does not in turn incentivize building. Building a system, building a government that has integrity requires a lot of hard work and trial and error and making mistakes and improving on those mistakes. And basically, he's sort of predicting the mobs are going to do their best to tear down the system, but what replaces it after that is actually not that stable and potentially not much better. So that's the basic idea. Now let me give a slightly longer overview before I go into details about the book. So one thing to note is that when he says the public, he doesn't actually mean the people or everybody. He means essentially the people who rise up, the people who see the problem with the system and take action and go into the streets protesting and do a lot of things to tear down the system. And one thing he points out that is somewhat surprising, but kind of also makes sense, is that a lot of people in this group that he considers to be the public are people from elite classes. They're young people with university degrees who would potentially have a lot of privilege in society, but they see the problems with the system. Now, how does social media come in? Social media basically creates this unintended transparency where people can see the flaws within the governing class. They can see the internal pettiness and internal arguments between these people and the people in the ruling class. When their imperfections are sort of shown to the world, that is reason for discontent. And that also creates this spiral to some degree, because when those people in power feel threatened by everybody knowing their greatest weaknesses that are plastered all over the internet, that group sort of comes together to protect their privilege, and that creates even more distrust and strife as information about the ways they're protecting themselves gets out, and it just leads to this dynamic. So he frames this as a conflict between the establishment, which is organized in a hierarchical way, where the people at the top of the establishment are sort of protecting their power, and that's contrasted with the public, who is networked, who's more on the fringes, critiquing the establishment. The result of this is perpetual instability, because when the public gets their way and is able to destroy parts of the system, whatever rises in its place doesn't necessarily have anything better going on. Now, he does leave the book with hope, with some principles for how we could move forward, so I will get there, but I'm going to outline in greater detail some of the things he points out in the book. Now, earlier in the book, he has a chapter explaining what the public is not. And of course, the public is not the people, but the public does pretend to be the people. For example, the people who are protesting, who are rising up against the elites, they claim to be speaking for the entire population. Now, one of the reasons the public is not speaking for the entire population is because the entire population is not all paying attention to the same injustices and the same flaws in the system at once. Like, if you look at what is on everybody's mind, For a lot of people, it's like getting their kids to school and going to work. Not everybody is deeply paying attention to the political atmosphere. But as you might expect, people who have the potential to rise within that political atmosphere and the potential to find places of power because they have the education and the skills and the connections, those people have a greater incentive to actually try to displace those currently in power. So they speak on behalf of the public. Now, this doesn't mean that they're wrong. A lot of times these injustices and these flaws with the establishment they're pointing out are absolutely accurate. I mean, it's coming about because of the newly formed transparency that social media and the online space brings us. But just like with the 1% and the 99%, if you remember back to the Occupy Wall Street movement, a lot of those people were talking about these complicated economic principles that not everybody was paying attention to. So the second piece of this is the two groups that are in conflict, where some people will say this is the center and the border. Now, he contrasts these two groups, the center and the public, where the center is the establishment, hierarchically organized. The center advocates for continuation of the status quo because that's what gives them power. And they have a bunch of procedures in place to protect the status quo. They're sometimes smug about those procedures. The public is sometimes also referred to as the border. And this group is networked. It's voluntary. The main unifying force of the border is their opposition to the center, their opposition to the establishment. But a lot of times that's the only unifying force of the border. It's sort of bringing together a bunch of different groups with really different interests that are coming together just because they oppose the center, they oppose the establishment. And therefore, the border or the public has a tendency to splinter. If you ask them to actually do anything constructive or come up with policies that would help fix the problems that they're critiquing, a lot of times they can't. They just disagree among themselves. Some of them don't have any vision other than destroying the center. So the border doesn't really have the organizational power to actually do anything meaningful. Now, these new dynamics are a direct result of social media and of this new transparency we have, where we get glimpses into the inside dynamics of the people in the ruling class. We see glimpses of their character flaws. We see cracks in their story that keeps them in power. So all governing classes have sort of stories about why they deserve to be in power. And when you can actually glimpse into the way they're operating on a day-to-day basis and sort of pick out the times when they're not living up to that justifying story, that's going to create this sense of unrest. And we know with every group of people, there's going to be petty jealousies and status jockeying within the group. That's just something that's going to become apparent if we ever get a hold of emails within any group, whether it's a church group or a civic organization or an academic department or a department within a corporation. Human interactions and human groups over time just tend to have this inherent instability because of just the human condition. And what creates unity within a group? Well, the thing that tends to create unity is when the group needs to come together against an external force that threatens them. Well, with people who are operating in a group that's sort of at the top of the hierarchy, that has power and privilege, the most likely thing that's going to threaten that group is actually people who want to take away their prestigious positions. So when you get people sort of pointing out the illegitimacy of any group that's in power, they tend to come together and try to protect themselves. And if there's ever information about them doing that, protecting their own power instead of serving in the roles they're supposed to be serving for the population, then that's going to look even worse for them. So this is kind of a natural dynamic that results because we can see these glimpses into what's actually going on. Now, is it possible or realistic to create a ruling class that has none of these foibles? Probably not. But certainly there are ruling classes that are more just than others. So that's going to be part of what we need to think about if we want a solution to this. What is a reasonable expectation for the public to have of their ruling class? Okay, so what are his solutions? And I want to point out that he's actually really humble about solutions. He basically says it's really hard to predict how any given solution will play out. And the other humble thing he did that I really appreciated was he gave this thesis that I've just described. And he said, here are some things that would be disconfirmation of his thesis. So like if we do have a stable world going forward without an increase in uprisings and whatnot, that would actually disprove his thesis. But of course, his thesis has really played out in the last few years. So kudos to him. So let me just go through a few of the solutions he proposes. One of them is that decision-making about important things in the economy and in society need to be moved from the top of the hierarchy down to people who are who know more about what they're deciding about, who are sort of more embedded in the network of people that make up the public. Another thing that would almost certainly need to happen if we want to restore the world to stability is just more reasonable expectations from the public about what leaders can and cannot do. So leaders are operating on really complex systems, and if we expect sort of the one leader of the country to be able to directly control prices and specific opportunities and hostility between groups and all of the things that we place our expectations on them for, then we're going to be disappointed. We're sort of setting our expectations at a place where the expectations themselves are actually a barrier toward improvement. He points out that we can't really get away from hierarchy entirely. There will have to be people at the top who are making decisions. But we need people who can earn the trust of the public by being honest with the public about what they can accomplish, by having integrity, by choosing people that the public will naturally respect. And that doesn't mean that they have to be perfect. People can respect people who are actual human beings who make mistakes, as long as they're transparent and they're honest about their communication, as long as they're humble and willing to listen to the people, to hear the real needs of the people, and ideally as long as they can articulate back to different segments of the population, what is your main grievance? How does your main grievance connect with specific actions? And when I do take an action as a leader, what are some potential negative consequences, negative side effects? Just to at least acknowledge that you know there's going to be second and third order effects that you can't control. He talks about how the people in power need to be able to communicate what they're doing and why they're doing it in language that the networked public can actually understand. Like having laws that are sort of full of jargon and intentionally trying to obscure what they're actually doing, that's not going to work well in an age with this much information flowing around the internet. And then we need ways of rewarding elites for the modesty of their claims of what they can actually accomplish. We need ways of rewarding elites for listening carefully to the people, for not putting up barriers between themselves and the public. Because it's natural to want to try to erect those barriers that protect you from the public. What they have to say is painful to the elites, but elites who can actually handle that interaction with the public, as uncomfortable as it can become sometimes. That's a basic overview. Now, if you actually read the book, you need to sort of gear up for examples of political instability in countries you may not have been paying attention to in 2011. Lots of situations you may not have the background to fully get into or to fully have your own view on that political situation. But in some ways, that's one of the strengths of the book, is that he's looking at different political circumstances than the 2020s in the United States or than wherever you happen to be. And he's applying these principles in ways that actually translate really well, both across time and across geographical space.